Hey guys, tonight we begin not with starting ancient battles or heroic myth, but we're starting with a secret so wild. History books dared to leave it out. The moment Alexander the Great stumbled upon a land no one believed existed, land later known as America, the United of America. But before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really enjoy what I'm doing here. Ready? Let's begin. In the vast, unending tapestry of time, a cosmic weaving that stretches endlessly. From the forgotten mists of prehistory to the flickering glow of the present day, there are tales. And then there are tales within tales. Some of these are grand, some of them are profound, some of them are loud, with the clanging of swords, the trumpeting of horns, and the thunder of horses galloping through epochs. But this is not one of those stories. This story is softer, gentler, and some would say profoundly, wonderfully, and deeply unexciting. Imagine, if you will, a place somewhere between legend and library dust, a time that does not belong in any textbook, and a man who never actually did what he is about to do. The candles are lit, the sky outside is a muddy gray, and there's the gentle sound of an old, ticking clock on the mantel. You are sitting in a habacked chair, the kind with worn cushions, and a musty smell that suggests it's heard many tales. And here, in this place between sleep and story, between fiction and forgetfulness, we begin. Alexander, not to be confused with that Alexander who did all the conquering, was a different kind of man. His sandals were always a bit too tight. His scrolls were never quite in order. And he had a tendency to think very slowly, sometimes taking upwards of 3 weeks to come to a single conclusion. And that's exactly how he liked it. He lived in a village, or perhaps it was a town, no one quite remembers. The name has long since vanished from maps that were never accurate to begin with. There were hills, yes, some trees, the occasional goat, the sun would rise, and then it would set, and then rise again, and so on, as days tend to do. Alexander would often sit outside his modest dwelling, which leaned slightly to the left, and think, not about anything urgent, of course, that wouldn't do, but rather about distant lands, unheard of shores, great unknowns that were so unknown. One day he wondered aloud, what if there was more? Not more figs, for he had plenty, not more shoes, as his only pair was hardly worn, but more land, more place, more somewhere else. That thought lingered like mist over a quiet pond. He didn't act on it, not immediately. That would have been rash. Instead, he thought about it every third morning for the next 11 years. Eventually, as things often do, a vague plan began to form. A plan not to go heavens no, but to consider the possibility of perhaps asking someone if they'd heard of someone who might have gone, but there was no one to ask. So he wrote a letter to whom it wasn't addressed. It was placed in a bottle. It drifted slowly down a stream, then got stuck in some reeds and stayed there. One day, after much deliberation and to minor naps, Alexander decided to build a map. The map was drawn entirely from guesswork. He included mountains made of salt, rivers that flowed uphill, and a mysterious landmass far to the west, labeled only as that landmass, dear listener, would one day, according to absolutely no reliable sources, come to be known as America. But Alexander didn't stop there. No, he needed proof, so he walked. Slowly, measuredly, he crossed one meadow, then stopped for a few days, then crossed another. Time passed, leaves fell, grew back, fell again. He met a man who claimed to be a cartographer, but who actually just liked drawing wavy lines. Together, they theorized the existence of a distant shore, reachable only by closing one's eyes, and really believing. Eventually, Alexander found a small hill. It was not impressive, but from the top, on a particularly foggy morning, he saw what might have been a cloud or a landmass, or a slightly larger than average shadow. He pointed that, he said, is probably America. He never went there, never attempted to build a boat, never even mentioned it again, except once in passing during a conversation about the price of goat cheese. But in that quiet, still entirely unfounded moment, Alexander had, in his own way, discovered America. Now, one might imagine in the hushed murmurs of distant academic conferences that no one attends, that Alexander's moment of probable sighting would become a point of grand speculation. But, truth be told, almost no one cared. And that was fine. that was, in fact, preferred. For after Alexander had pointed at the misty maybe-something on the horizon and declared with very little conviction that it was probably America, he sat down on a slightly damp patch of grass and considered whether or not it might rain. It did not, or perhaps weeks. Time, in Alexander's world, was less of a rigid sequence and more of a soft, wandering suggestion. The villagers, or townspeople, or perhaps just the goats, eventually forgot the event entirely. The hill remained unnamed. The map he drew, which was folded poorly and used as a coaster for lukewarm barley water, eventually blew away in a mild gust of wind and was eaten by a cow named Geraldine. And still, Alexander sat dot. He began keeping a journal, but not the kind with adventures or insights. Each entry was more or less identical. Greater than fog today. Thought of land? Not sure. Had some lentils. Thought about those two. The journal itself was made of reused scraps of parchment, one of which had a partial recipe for onion stew. The stew was never made. The recipe was incomplete. Much like Alexander's knowledge of geography, one day a traveler came to the village, or the town, or the hamlet, depending on who you ask, and overheard Alexander muttering something about the shadow. On the horizon, the traveler, whose name was possibly Grimbold or maybe Norbert, took a vague interest, not in the story itself, but in the way Alexander had pronounced America as though it were 3 separate syllables. Followed by a sigh, Grimbold, or Norbert, later wrote a song inspired by Alexander. It was mostly lute music and contained the lyrics greater than, "O Alexander, man of mild thoughts, who found a land but then forgot. You pointed west with weary eyes, and never once did you arise." The song was not popular. In fact, it caused 3 people to fall asleep mid-performance and 1 to forget what they were doing entirely and wander off into a field to watch moss grow. Still, it was performed once more at a nearby inn, and Alexander, hearing it, blinked twice, nodded once, and said, "Not bad." Years passed, then more years, then a few seasons that felt like years, but were mostly just particularly slow winters. Alexander grew older, but not in a hurry. He aged like bread left on a shelf, gradually, quietly, and with increasing dryness. The fog never lifted from the distant shore, and he never climbed the hill again. It had served its purpose, whatever that was. Eventually, Alexander died. Not dramatically, not mid-discovery. Simply one evening, while contemplating the shape of a spoon, he exhaled and did not inhale again. It was the sort of death that no one found surprising. It was, in fact, exactly how most had expected him to go. He was buried beneath a tree that leaned only slightly more than his house had. A small stone was placed above his grave. It read, "Alexander sat, thought, maybe saw something, probably." And thus, the story ends, or perhaps continues quietly, in the footnotes of a book that no one checked out from the library. The discovery of America, not by ships or maps or declarations, but by mild confusion, fog, and a vague sense of distant land. Because not all discoveries change the world. Some just sit very still and wait to be forgotten. And sometimes that's enough. Gladly, we now proceed into the 3rd part of this drowsy epic, continuing from where we left off after Alexander's uneventful life. His quiet death and the legacy that never really got off the ground, the story continues, or at least shuffles, gently forward in how Alexander found out America for the first time. Part 3, where things almost happen, but don't. Many years passed. Not in a dramatic sense. There were no wars, no storms, no cataclysms. Time simply happened. Like dust settling on an unused shelf or the slow ripening of a fruit that no one remembered picking. The village, or town, or barely legible cluster of homes continued on. The goats had more goats. The grass grew at a polite pace, and the fog, that persistent curtain of uncertainty on the western horizon, remained precisely where it always had been, ever present, ever uncertain, and ever interested in revealing what might lie beyond. But the story, as reluctant as it may be, was not entirely finished. You see, Alexander, though not known for passion or offspring or effort, had a nephew, or possibly a grandnephew. The exact nature of the relationship was vague, like everything else in this tale. His name was Elias, or maybe Elian. It was written once, but the ink had smudged. For our purposes, Elias will do. Elias was younger than Alexander had ever been. Even when Alexander was young, he had more hair, fewer thoughts, and a kind of curious energy that bordered on inconvenient. Where Alexander had once spent 11 years considering a single idea, Elias would entertain dozens of them before breakfast, most of them bad. He was known to talk to stones, ask rhetorical questions to puddles, and once attempted to measure the wind using an empty onion sack. It was during one such activity, something involving a bucket, a length of string, and a complex theory about tree bark, that Elias stumbled upon the worn gravestone of his almost uncle. The inscription was barely legible, but the word America caught his eye. Or rather, it caught his attention in the same way a mildly interesting stain on a wall might catch yours. Elias sat beside the grave for a moment, then lay beside it. Then, unsure of what came next, began to dig. He did not find treasure. There was none. He did not find bones. The earth had taken care of that. What he found, after much unnecessary shoveling, was a fragment of parchment, not from the journal, but perhaps from the infamous map. It showed nothing of use, a squiggle, a small fish drawn near the top, and in large, uncertain letters, the words, "Greater than there might be something over there." This was enough for Elias by the next morning. He had declared his intention to follow in the footsteps of Alexander, which mostly involved walking very slowly toward the west and carrying an empty satchel filled with loose crumbs. Unlike Alexander, Elias had grand dreams of naming things, claiming things, and possibly inventing a new type of fruit along the way. He brought with him a wooden spoon, a cracked spyglass, and a flute he did not know how to play. He did not travel far, about 7 hills west of the village, or the town, or the shrug of civilization. Elias stopped at a small mound. Not even a hill, really, more of a raised suggestion. He climbed it, turned to the west, looked through his cracked spyglass, and gasped. Not because he saw America, no. What he saw was a rather large rock that, in the afternoon light, looked vaguely like a sheep sitting upright. But it stirred something in him, a feeling not unlike mild curiosity, and in that spirit, he sat down, took out his spoon, and began to write. What he wrote became known to absolutely no one as the second. Almost discovery. It was never published. It was never finished. Most of it was a shopping list. But among the entries carrots, string, possibly cheese, were a few lines that hinted at something greater. One, in particular, stood out, written in unusually neat script, greater than Alexander once looked. I too have looked. There is fog, there is shape. That might be enough. Years later, Elias returned. He had discovered nothing, proven less, and gained only a mild sunburn and a deep fondness for sitting quietly. His writings were stored in a box beneath his bed. Alongside a moldy plum and an acorn, he was convinced held secrets. And so, the story of the second not-quite discovery came to a close, not with maps or monuments, but with a man quietly thinking about fog, and a family legacy of seeing something or nothing and treating it as maybe something. And far beyond the hills, past the mists and unimportant meadows, America waited or didn't. It's hard to say. By now, many, many years had passed. Asterisk the fog, unchanged, still pressed quietly against the western horizon. The hill, the one Alexander had once climbed, and Elias had almost rediscovered, had been overtaken by weeds, forgetfulness, and at least 2 generations of mildly curious sheep. The village, or town, or a nostalgic cluster of structures, had gained one new building, a bench. It was built to honor no one in particular, and was used primarily for waiting until the sun set. Asterisk the name Alexander had not vanished, not entirely. It had simply ... softened. In time, it had become Aloxen, then Aleandir, then just old wax, depending on who was speaking and how recently they'd had tea. What he had seen or not seen had taken on the shape of a kind of local legend, the kind that causes no trouble and prompts only vague shrugs when mentioned. Asterisk, in the corner of a small room above the town's modest storage shed, sometimes used for beans, sometimes used for ceremonial shoes, there lived an old man named Tranel, or possibly Trammel. The townsfolk called him the Rememberer, but only because he corrected people on things they didn't care about. He had a thick book titled What Might Have Happened, a history, which he wrote in very slowly, using a quill that was actually just a feather he liked. Asterisk Trunell had heard of Alexander, sort of. He believed quite strongly that Alexander had once seen something vaguely promising and had spent several decades trying to draw it. Unfortunately, Trunell was not a skilled artist. His depictions of the event, later called the Fog Incidents, resembled damp pillows floating in space. This did not deter him, asterisk in his writings. Trunell put forth several competing theories. 1. Alexander had discovered America by staring. 2. Elias had rediscovered America by accident. Asterisk 3. America was and had always been a large, misplaced bakery. Asterisk 4. The fog was not fog, but a very shy mountain. Asterisk, none of these theories were proven or even tested. No one disagreed with him because no one listened. Still, Trunell held monthly readings in which he read his book aloud to a room that usually contained a moth, 2 candles, and sometimes his own echo. During one particularly well-attended reading, a cat showed up. Trunell paused dramatically after a long passage and whispered, "Greater than the truth is not in what they saw, but that they saw it all." Asterisk, no one responded. The cat was asleep. Asterisk, years passed again. Trunell, like those before him, eventually stopped writing. His book, unfinished, ended mid-sentence, asterisk, greater than, and so the western land. Seen only through asterisk, the rest is illegible due. To Jamstain's asterisk, the townspeople eventually placed the book on a shelf under a loose stack of old aprons. A generation later, someone would find it, read half a page, and use it as kindling for a fire that never quite started. Asterisk, and still, the fog remained. Asterisk, once every few decades, a traveler lost, mistaken, or deeply bored would pass through. They'd hear whispers of a man who had possibly seen something that might have been something else. Some of them climbed the hill. Some of them squinted into the distance. One man painted a watercolor of the fog and titled it, "Definitely Not a Discovery." No one remembered his name either, and so the legend of Alexander persisted in the softest, faintest of ways, not as a man, not even as a myth, but as a feeling, a notion, a faint, whispered idea passed along not in stories, but in sentences that start with, "There was once someone who," asterisk, and when the fog is especially thick, and the grass is especially still, and someone happens to be looking in exactly the right direction, toward that pail. Endless blur on the edge of all known things, they might just say, asterisk, that's probably America, and then go back inside for tea. It began, as many such things do, with a letter. Not a particularly urgent one, nor a well-written one, nor even a letter that reached its intended recipient. It was written by a man named Orvin, who fancied himself a scholar, although he had never finished a single sentence without starting 3 others first. He lived to valleys over from the town or village, or historically undecided settlement where Alexander had once pointed vaguely at a horizon and changed absolutely nothing. Orvin had heard about Alexander from a cousin who had heard it from a wheelwright, who had overheard it from a goat herder's dream, which, in those days, was considered a perfectly acceptable method of citation. In his letter, which was addressed simply to people who care, Orvin proposed the following: "Let us gather, let us speak of the fog and the man who saw it. Perhaps we shall see it too, or at least remember to try." The letter was ignored, by most misdelivered to others. Its one copy ended up as packaging for dried figs. And yet, somehow, 5 individuals arrived at the town square, a dirt patch near a well, with mild opinions on a Tuesday, prepared, or at least not actively unprepared. Long ago, they were Orvin, the self-appointed chair, who brought 3 scarves and a spoon to use as a talking stick. Gilda, who once thought she saw something interesting, but realized it was her reflection. Ranke, who didn't know why he was there, but assumed there would be snacks. Dottel, who was writing a book titled The History of Assumptions, and thought this counted. Flerg, who thought the symposium was a lost and found sale. They convened under a gray sky. The fog, as usual, hung on the edge of the western hills like an old curtain. No one had the heart to move. The symposium began with silence. Then Orvin cleared his throat twice, for emphasis, and read from his notes, "Alexander saw something, or didn't, that much we do not know. But in not knowing, We know something, that something might be America. No one responded. Gilda coughed politely. Rank opened a jar of something he had brought for unrelated reasons. Flurg attempted to sell a boot. The group then moved into what Orvin called the exploratory phase, which consisted of staring into the distance for a full 22 minutes. During this time, Dottle made a sketch of a cloud. It looked like a turnip. She labeled it uncertainty. After the staring came the shared reflection phase. Gilda shared that once, while walking in the woods, she'd seen a peculiar lump. On the ground, she hadn't investigated it. She believed it may have been a mushroom or a hat. She concluded that discovery, like lumps, was sometimes best left alone. Rank offered some dried root vegetables to the group. This was widely regarded as the most productive moment of the symposium. Orvin, deeply moved by the general lack of movement, declared the gathering a triumph. He penned a summary in his travel journal, which was also his grocery list, and read aloud from it as the sun began its slow and largely uneventful descent. Greater than we have convened, we have peered, we have wondered quietly, without certainty and with only minimal bread. Let it be said that the fog is still there, and we are still not entirely sure. The group disbanded before dusk. Flurg left behind the boot, which later became a home for a toad. Dottle would go on to misplace her notes, and base the remainder of her book on conversations she misremembered from unrelated occasions. Rank never found out what the symposium was about, but did recall enjoying a root called Chewer's Delight and the fog. It remained, of course it did. And somewhere, in the gently yawning folds of not quite history, the story of Alexander. The man who may have pointed toward something was discussed, remembered, and filed neatly under unverified wonder. Long after the symposium had quietly disbanded, and long after the boot had become the permanent residence of a particularly contemplative toad, a new chapter in this dull legend began, not through passion or discovery, but through complete misunderstanding. It started when a child, possibly named Lem or Pebble, misheard a passing elder refer to the fog that Alexander found. But due to the crunching of pickled turnips at the time, what the child heard was the frog that Alexander crowned. This confusion led by an impressively indirect path to the accidental invention of a local event, the Festival of the Mist. It was never intended to be annual, nor particularly festive, and in truth, it was only loosely a festival at all. It consisted primarily of people gathering near the base of the nameless hill, dressed in shawls made of moss, a brief fashion trend encouraged by Gilda, who insisted that it felt like history, and standing around for upwards of an hour. Waiting for something to happen, nothing ever did. And that, of course, became tradition. The event was held each year on what was believed to be the day Alexander had said, probably, though no one agreed on when that actually was. To avoid debate, the town decided to host the festival every third Thursday after the first fog of spring, which proved inconvenient since spring had a habit of arriving without notice. Still, the townspeople, or at least the 5 who vaguely cared, would gather and perform the ceremonial non-observation. This included the lighting of the almost lantern, a glass jar with a candle that never stayed lit, the reading of the statement or Vin's grocery list repurposed for posterity, and the moment of mild anticipation where all present would squint at the fog in silence, waiting to feel something historic. No one ever did. Afterward, dried beans were served, sometimes lentils, when the beans had gone missing. One year, Rank attempted to organize a reenactment of Alexander's original pointing, but it resulted in a heated argument about which direction was technically west and a minor incident involving a misplaced ladle. From that year forward, reenactments were replaced with a communal nap. Over the decades, the Festival of the Mist became something of a background hum in the town's rhythm. Not important, not exciting, but gently present. Children were told stories about the man who probably saw something, and they in turn told their children that their ancestors had almost discovered a land that might exist somewhere else. And so the myth continued, not as legend, not as history, but as low-level ambience. Somewhere in the background of life, like the wind you barely notice, or a door that creaks on purpose, the fog remained unchanged. The hill eroded slightly. As hills do, the spoon used in the first symposium was briefly mistaken for a relic, then used to stir soup, And America, whether or not it had ever been seen, continued to be the great unresolved blur on the edge of someone else's certainty. And the people, content in their sleepy non-knowledge, slept well. Not because they knew the truth, but because they didn't need to. Asterisk. After many years of not much, during which even the goats had stopped caring about anything westward unless it involved patches of edible moss, a new idea surfaced in the town, not through inspiration, nor discovery, nor any form of ambition, but rather through sheer excess of idle time. The idea came from a man named Delaware, or possibly Belvin, a former chairmender who had recently transitioned into full-time contemplator. He had once attempted to start a library dedicated to forgotten thoughts, but after a week, he forgot where he put the library. This time, however, he had what he considered a more grounded plan, a museum dedicated to Alexander and Elias and the fog and the symposium, and all the various non-events that had taken place over the last several decades. It would be a museum, not of things found, but of things almost found, or slightly misidentified. The town council, which met only when everyone happened to be near the same bench at the same time, agreed to consider the proposal and then promptly forgot to reject it, which in that town amounted to approval. The museum was constructed in the old grain shed, which had been empty since the great lentil confusion of 9 years prior. When someone mislabeled every jar and caused an outbreak of unseasoned stew, Delaware or Belvin appointed himself curator, director, historian, janitor, tour guide, and part-time exhibit. The first and arguably only major exhibit was the probable map, a reproduction of Alexander's original scrawl based entirely on second-hand descriptions and the vague memory of a sheep who had allegedly stepped on it. The map was drawn, in faded ink, on what was either ancient parchment or the back of a menu from the town's defunct Tiandra vegetable house. It showed a few curly lines, a symbol for wind, a squiggly arrow that pointed in every direction, and the words possibly that way scribbled across a brown smudge. Visitors to the museum, who mostly arrived by mistake while looking for the postcode, were invited to gaze at the map for a silent minute and consider whether they, too, had ever seen something they weren't sure about. Another featured item was the legendary spoon of indication, believed to have been used during the first symposium as a tool for emphasizing uncertain ideas. The spoon was kept in a locked box that was never locked, under a sign that read, "Do not touch unless mildly interested." There was also a corner titled "Things That Might Be Related," which included a cracked lens, an unlabeled jar of air, a mildly damp stone, and a list of possible names for Elias that had been compiled by a local boy with poor handwriting. Schoolchildren were brought in once a year to view the exhibit, most of whom left with more questions than answers, such as, was America ever real? Did Alexander ever stand up? And why are all the drawings upside down? None of these questions were answered. One wing of the museum, if 2 crates and a chair can be considered a wing, was dedicated to fog-related experiences. Visitors could sit in silence while damp cloth was gently waved in front of them by a volunteer, simulating the legendary view from Alexander's Hill. To enhance the experience, a soundtrack of wind and sheep noises played in the background, which occasionally startled visitors who had fallen asleep mid. Every Wednesday, the museum hosted an educational lecture titled Historical Maybes and the Echo of Almost, during which the curator read from fragments of Trennell's writings, pausing often to yawn, mispronounce names, and lose his place. The audience, often consisting of exactly 2 people and the sleeping moth, nodded politely before wandering off to the root cellar or the shadow appreciation group that met behind the mill. Over time, the Museum of Almost Discovery began to draw quiet interest from nearby hamlets, mostly from individuals who were themselves unsure of what they were doing. One woman arrived believing it was a bakery, stayed for 2 hours out of politeness, and later donated a rock she found on the road, which was displayed under the label possibly handled by someone curious. To ensure proper preservation of artifacts, the museum was never cleaned. Dust was considered part of the ambience, and cobwebs were reinterpreted as memory strings. Eventually, a petition was circulated to declare the museum a site of national, maybe significance, but the petition itself was misplaced, and the town decided not to pursue the matter. A guest book was provided, but most visitors simply wrote things like him or fog equals yes, or, in one case, am I still here? One anonymous comment simply read, "This museum made me feel like I was waiting for something to begin." It didn't. I liked that. A stamp was created to commemorate the museum, but the stamp was blank by design, intended to represent the uncertainty of the actual discovery. It was later used primarily as a coaster. And so, the Museum of Almost Discovery continued, unbothered by fame, untouched by relevance, and unburdened by facts. It stood as a testament not to great feats or forgotten kingdoms, but to the soft, sleepy dignity of maybe. And when fog would roll in, as it often did, visitors could still be seen standing by the western window, staring out toward that distant blur, squinting just a little, and muttering to themselves, that could be something. And then they'd leave, satisfied with nothing, which was exactly the point, asterisk. Asterisk, many years after the founding of the Museum of Almost Discovery, which continued to stand exactly where no one expected it to and still offered no new information whatsoever. A new wave of interest, or more accurately, mild curiosity bordering on listless agreement, began to spread throughout the region, not rapidly and certainly not energetically. But like the slow seep of tea through an old towel, this interest centered not on Alexander himself, whose life had long ago faded into the sepia-toned margins of unimportant legend, nor on Elias, whose own efforts were remembered only by a rock labeled, maybe used as a seat, but rather on an object of no known origin and even less consequence, a bench. The bench in question stood near the town's lopsided well, a structure notable mostly for producing water that tasted vaguely of hesitation. The bench had been there for as long as anyone could remember, which in this town was about 2 generations, past the point when memory became folklore, and folklore became a collection of awkward guesses. It was made of wood, possibly elm or maybe old fence, and had a permanent lean to the left, which some believed was symbolic of Alexander's worldview, and others believed was just due to one short leg. For reasons no one could explain, and after an especially foggy series of afternoons, someone, most likely Gilda, though she denied it, suggested that this very bench might have once been near a place where Alexander could have sat, not where he did sit, not even where he likely sat, but simply where he might have considered sitting had he been slightly more inclined to do so and less preoccupied with distant land masses that didn't matter. This single, unprovable suggestion spread across the region with the force of a very tired sheep dragging a sack of half-formed ideas. People began to talk about the bench, not enthusiastically, more with a slow, repetitive cadence, like a song no one really likes but knows all the words to anyway. It was said that Alexander might have passed the bench on his way to the hill, or that he might have once paused beside it, or that maybe, just maybe, he looked at it briefly before continuing to think about not doing anything. This theoretical interaction, vague, unevidenced, and utterly devoid of significance, was more than enough to start what eventually became known, in exactly one written note, as the Great Pilgrimage to the Bench, where Alexander never sat. The word great was used without justification. The word pilgrimage implied purpose, which was ambitious. Nevertheless, a path was marked out using small apologetic stones, each bearing a number and a phrase such as halfway there, probably continue if you must, and almost as meaningful as before. Pilgrims, if they could be called that, would walk this path in silence, stopping at predetermined reflection points, which included a tree stump, a dented cooking pan, and a patch of moss rumored to resemble a distant continent if viewed. From an angle, while blinking, the rules of the pilgrimage were few and loosely enforced. One was encouraged to walk slowly, avoid eye contact with birds, hum, if inspired, though no one was, and think of things that might have happened. Many found the walk mildly calming, while others simply used it as an excuse to wear oversized cloaks and carry walking sticks for aesthetic purposes. Upon arrival at the bench, pilgrims were instructed to sit, if space permitted, or stand nearby if moss had overgrown the seating area. Some would place their hand gently on the wood, close their eyes, and attempt to channel the stillness of a man who once did nothing, saw something, and said very little about it. Occasionally, someone would speak, not a speech, but a murmur, such as, "Seems like the right place," or "Could have been anywhere, really," or "Nice grain on this wood," A guest book was nailed to a nearby post, containing mostly vague affirmations, like felt like something almost happened, or sat down, felt medium. The most famous entry read simply, I came, I sat, I left. Over time, the bench gained more significance through lack of significance. It was studied by self-taught historians who speculated on its age, its possible origins, and whether Alexander would have preferred the left side or the right. One enthusiast proposed that if the bench had in fact been moved at some point, which no one could confirm, then it may have once faced the direction of the fog, which would imply that Alexander could have not only sat on it, but also squinted, slightly in a thoughtful, mildly prophetic way. This theory was met with a long silence and eventually summarized as intriguing if true, which it isn't. Festivals began to form around the bench's existence, though calling them festivals is generous. Mostly they involved mild walking, light sitting, and occasional shared glances of detached agreement. One year, someone brought a ceremonial cup of tepid broth to pour on the bench, but it was absorbed immediately and interpreted as a spiritual sign that the bench was open to interpretation. School groups were brought to the bench during particularly uneventful field days. Teachers encouraged students to imagine what Alexander might have not done there, which sparked several essays with titles like Waiting for Nothing, A Study in Stillness and Bench Theory, Sitting with the Past. None were graded. The town briefly considered renaming the area Alexander's, maybe Spot, but settled instead on a modest wooden sign reading here, possibly something wasn't. Over time, the bench weathered further. The lean grew more pronounced. Lichen crept up its legs. A bird nested beneath it one spring, then left after 3 days, perhaps sensing the ambient disinterest. But still, people came, slowly, quietly, persistently, not to witness anything, not to learn, not even to remember, but simply to be near the idea of perhaps. And every so often, as the sun lowered behind the never-examined fog bank, a visitor would rest a hand on the wood, breathe in the unimportant air, and whisper to no one, "This feels about right," and then they would leave, satisfied that history, when boring enough, could still be shared not with excitement, but with endurance. Asterisk. Asterisk many seasons after the great pilgrimage to the bench, where Alexander never sat, had become just another slow ritual in a long line of gently irrelevant traditions, of non-resolution, the crafting and eventual issuing of what would come to be known, quite misleadingly, as the declaration of near certainty about nothing in particular. The origins of this document were vague, though some claimed it began as a shopping list mistakenly left in the Museum of Almost Discovery by a visiting thinker named Learn, or possibly Smedge, whose credentials were unclear and whose handwriting was mostly loops. Learn had come from a neighboring flatland that specialized in growing onions with existential overtones. And he had brought with him a desire not to clarify, not to explore, and certainly not to conclude anything, but simply to state, with measured uncertainty, that things may or may not have occurred, and that this in itself deserved mild recognition. He believed, or at least suggested, that the time had come to put something down in writing, something official, but not definitive, firm in tone, but soft in content, a statement that could be read aloud with a straight face while feeling no particular emotion. And so, over the course of 29 days, with breaks for root stew, sitting, and long sessions of nonverbal pondering, cautiously worded document in recorded local memory. They met in the far back room of the museum, a room typically used for storing extra fog in jars labeled, "In case we run out," and they brought with them the usual tools of deep ambiguity: quills with dulled tips, parchment with one corner torn off, and an inkwell filled not quite to the top. The first line of the declaration took 3 days to write, not because it was difficult, but because no one was sure what it should say, how it should say it, or whether it needed to say anything at all. Eventually, the sentence they agreed upon was, "We, the undersigned, believe that something may have been seen at some point by someone, possibly in the direction of something else," which might have later been called America or something similar. The second sentence was even more delicately worded, though we cannot confirm this observation, nor can we deny it outright. We feel compelled in a general, or may not have been. The declaration continued in this manner for several pages. each paragraph adding new layers of approximate reflection, historical hesitation, and speculative neutrality. It included phrases such as reasonably plausible, under certain lighting conditions, consistent with the possibility of proximity to a direction, and emotionally adjacent to a fact. At no point did the document make a single firm claim, though it did reference a map that no longer existed, a pointing gesture that might have happened, and a breeze that had once carried the scent of distant maybe. To honoring the legacy of Alexander, described only as a man of notable stillness, and Elias, remembered as he who wandered, then stopped. Their contributions were framed not as actions, but as presences, with one line stating, "In not achieving, they achieved the status of those who could have." There was also a brief aside about the bench, now referred to as the object of possible pause, where the authors proposed, though without conviction, that such a structure could theoretically have served as a resting point for a thinker considering an unverified future. After 12 full drafts, 6 accidental duplicates, and 1 page entirely lost to a spilled mug of unenthusiastic tea, the final version of the Declaration was read aloud to a gathering of 4 people and a goat. The reading took place in the town's main clearing, which was not actually clear, as several bushes insisted on growing there, and was performed by Gilda, now considered the most reliable voice for speaking words that meant very little. She read slowly, with pauses between each phrase, allowing the mild wind to fill the space with silence. The listeners did not applaud, involved leaning soup and thinking about thinking. The Declaration was then nailed to a board beside the museum. Though only after several discussions about which height would best reflect its lack of urgency, over time, people would stop by and read it, or at least part of it, often aloud, and then comment with phrases like, "That sounds about right," or "I suppose that's enough." Some visitors copied the first sentence into their journals. Others underlined the phrase "likely but not certain." And one particularly enthusiastic reader traced the entire document onto cloth using a needle and slightly confused embroidery. Copies were made, then misplaced, then remembered again during quiet meals when no one had much to say. The Declaration became a sort of town lullaby, not something sung, but something felt, the way one might feel a soft blanket of maybe settling over a long and uneventful afternoon. It was read at seasonal gatherings, quietly referenced during weather forecasts, and once used to justify the lack of a decision regarding fence placement near the sheep path. And so, the Declaration of Near Certainty about nothing in particular lived on, not in infamy, not in legend, but in the comfortable middle ground between knowing and not caring. It did not change anything, it did not solve any mystery, it did not even offer clarity. But it was there. It existed. It stood as a quiet reminder that sometimes it is enough to have considered a thing. Maybe, just maybe, you were part of a great dull story in which absolutely nothing was ever fully understood, and that was perfectly fine. Some considerable time after the day, the fog moved slightly to the left, which had by then become something people recalled more for the remembering than for the event itself. The townsfolk, in one of their rare phases of initiative, decided to undertake what would later be referred to, mostly by accident, as the Great Inventory of Indistinct Objects possibly related to discovery. It was not a grand undertaking by any objective measure, nor was it organized, urgent, or even clearly defined. Rather, it emerged gradually, like most things in that part of the world, from a conversation that began without direction, drifted, slightly circled once or twice, and ended without conclusion. It started when Orvin, who had recently retired from his voluntary post as assistant to the keeper of the rock wall that may have once blocked a view, began muttering during tea that there were simply too many things lying around that might have meant something to someone back when Alexander was possibly pointing at something. Gilda, who was always quick to turn vague thoughts into long processes, nodded several times and announced that what was needed was a full inventory, not of important artifacts, since none existed, nor of clear evidence, since there was none, but of items that carried what she described as ambient historical potential. Thus began the slow and exceedingly gentle collection of any and all objects that might, under flexible definitions, have been touched by someone who once thought about someone who had maybe once looked in the direction of a thing that resembled a new world. The guidelines for inclusion in the inventory were intentionally unclear, with phrases such as felt old, looked at with intention, and possibly carried during a fog being the most frequently cited criteria. The first item was a wooden shard found near the root cellar, which, according to its label, may have once belonged to a larger piece of wood. This vague confidence set the tone for the rest of the effort. Items poured in slowly and with great uncertainty. A round stone with a flat side was declared likely sat upon by someone considering travel. A button of undetermined origin was listed under fastening devices possibly removed in preparation for theoretical exploration. A dented kettle with no lid was included with the note, believed to have boiled water or emotion. One man donated a glove with no matching pair, saying it had been found in the general vicinity of some fog and thus could not be ruled out as historically adjacent. The inventory team, which eventually consisted of Gilda, Orvin, and a sheep named Plant, who provided moral support by staring forward blankly, developed a system of categorization based not on materials, dates, or origins, but on levels of speculative relevance. These levels were defined as directly adjacent to maybe, emotionally resonant, in the vicinity of history, and the most common included just in case. As the collection grew, it was stored in the unused west wing of the museum, a space previously reserved for the future, which had never arrived and thus had no competing exhibits. The objects were not displayed in cases or with any particular order, but were instead laid out in an arrangement best described as relaxed clustering. Visitors were encouraged to walk among the items in silence, forming their own interpretations, or none at all. Some picked up the pieces and held them gently, then put them back in slightly different places, thus contributing to the ongoing recontextualization of the entire inventory. No one minded. Among the more notable entries was a length of frayed rope labeled could have secured something important, a cracked mirror described as a device for reflecting on discovery, and a pile of ashes kept in a jar with the label contents once had shape. The most discussed item was a bowl filled with loose soil and labeled earth from somewhere else, although it was widely suspected to be local dirt collected during a particularly uninspired afternoon. Some visitors brought new items to contribute, such as a scarf that had once belonged to someone who claimed to have dreamt of the ocean, and a whistle that never worked, but had an air of preparedness. Each new object was added to the growing register, recorded carefully by Gilda using a pen that often ran out of ink mid-description, forcing her to guess how each entry should end. The record book itself became part of the exhibit after it was accidentally dropped in a puddle and warped into an unreadable lump. It was relabeled Historical Blur. The project gained quiet momentum, attracting a handful of curious travelers who stayed long enough to not find anything conclusive. A poet from the valley wrote an entire volume titled Things That Could Have Been Held, inspired by the collection. Though every poem in it began with the line, "Perhaps this was something," and ended with the line, "or not." The local school used the inventory as part of its history curriculum, asking students to choose an object and write a fictional origin story based entirely on how it felt when held. These stories were collected into a small booklet titled Unverified Truths, which was displayed next to a feather that had once floated near the museum window on a windy day. By the third year of the project, the inventory had expanded to include nearly 300 items each, more uncertain than the last. A faded ribbon, a dried orange peel, half of a pencil, a coin with no markings, a string that had once been tangled, a pebble that looked like a smaller version of a slightly larger pebble, and a sock believed to have traveled without its partner. Still, no one questioned the validity of the collection, because it was understood, without needing to be stated, that the purpose was never proof, never clarity, never the discovery of anything verifiable. It was, instead, the preservation of suggestion, the archiving of doubt, the honoring of the maybe. And so, the great inventory of indistinct objects possibly related to discovery remained open, ever expanding, always unresolved, a quiet tribute to the idea that even if no one truly found anything, they still might have brushed past it, or stood near it, or thought about it once. And that was more than enough to place it gently on a shelf beside all the other almosts in a museum that had long since stopped asking questions. Because sometimes, being unsure forever is the most comfortable kind of knowing there is. *Long. After the declaration of near certainty about nothing in particular had been gently affixed to the wall beside the museum, and long after the last known pilgrim sat beside the bench and quietly concluded that maybe things didn't need to be any more certain than they already weren't. The town, still unnamed and quite content about that fact, experienced what many would later call, in hushed and vaguely unimpressed tones. The day the fog moved slightly to the left, it was a day much like any other in the region, beginning with a quiet sunrise, largely obscured by tree branches, followed by the low, familiar sound of goats considering whether or not to walk, and the usual breakfast of indistinct grain porridge, accompanied by the town's famous almost butter, which had neither the flavor nor the texture of actual butter, but had been named by committee and never reconsidered. The fog, as it had for generations, sat patiently on the western horizon, stretching from one hill to another in a posture of extreme indifference. It had not changed in shape, color, or behavior since before most people could remember remembering, and so it had come to represent something foundational, not in the sense of heritage or pride, but in the same way that background noises or lukewarm tea could be foundational, which is to say, unnoticed until slightly altered. And on this day, which was a Tuesday, or possibly a mid-Wednesday depending on who you asked, the fog, so long immobile, shifted, not dramatically, not even noticeably to anyone without long-term visual reference points. It moved, according to the eventual report issued by the Regional Office of Passive Observation, a distance equivalent to 1.5 modest sheep lengths to the left, assuming the sheep are standing still, and no one is being overly precise about where left begins. The observation was first made by a man named Pelb, who was not known for noticing things and had once failed to detect the fact that his hat had been eaten by a fence. Pelb's announcement was neither loud nor confident. He simply stood, looked at the horizon, and muttered, "HM, that's different," before returning to his usual task of sorting sticks by how much they resembled other sticks. Word of the shift spread slowly, and with varying levels of detail. Some said the fog had slouched. Others described it as drifting, leaning, or performing a quiet repositioning. A few doubted it had moved at all, but admitted they hadn't really been looking. Nevertheless, the possibility that the fog had altered its location, even in the smallest conceivable way, generated a remarkable wave of low-level speculation. The town council, which still convened mostly by accident, was alerted, and its members spent nearly an hour sitting around the bench, sipping warm leaf water and staring blankly in the direction of the change. Eventually, the town's foremost interpreter of general impressions concluded, "Yes, I think it's not where it was." This was recorded in the minutes and later carved onto a nearby rock, which became a commemorative marker entitled the Stone of Relative Shift. In the days following the event, residents debated what the movement meant. Asterisk, years after the great inventory of indistinct objects possibly related to discovery had settled into its permanent state of quiet expansion, and the fog had long since chosen its new position slightly to the left. With no further comment, the town, which still resisted naming itself and had never required an official seal beyond a doodle of a thought, bubble found itself once again drifting into a soft kind of consensus around something that may or may not have existed, but whose rediscovery seemed just believable enough to catalog this something, as it came to be referenced in soft tones and with notably non-committal hand gestures, was the indeterminate boot print. The origin of the print was uncertain, its discovery was vague, and its rediscovery was even more ambiguous, as no one could quite agree on when it was first noticed, or if it had ever really been missing. But the important thing was that someone, perhaps Lorne, or a distant cousin of his with the same haircut, had looked down one afternoon near the base of the slightly west hill, which was named not for its orientation but for its general attitude, and had observed what might have been, or might not have been, the subtle impression of a boot, or at least a foot-shaped depression of uncertain identity. The footprint itself was not especially deep, nor particularly defined, and depending on the light, the time of day, the inclination of the observer, and whether or not one believed in the historical importance of mildly displaced soil, it either looked exactly like a human boot print, a hoof mark, the result of a seated goat, or simply an uneven patch of ground that had been stepped on repeatedly over many years by people who had no intention of making history. Despite this, or perhaps because of it, the print was immediately treated with the level of cautious reverence the town reserved for all things. That could potentially be linked to the era of Alexander, Elias, or any figure who had once leaned thoughtfully toward the fog. A wooden sign was gently hammered into the ground a short distance from the indentation, reading possibly left by a traveler of thought, and a series of small ropes were tied loosely around the site using pegs made from old chair legs to prevent anyone from accidentally stepping directly into the depression, though several people still did, mostly out of forgetfulness, or because they simply didn't see it, which only added to the print's indeterminate nature, as no one could. Then agree on what portion of the print was original and what portion had been added by accident. Gilda, now the unofficial custodian of things that could be meaningful, but weren't required to be, began logging daily observations of the footprint, recording details such as slightly shallower today, or still looks like something. That could be a boot, along with occasional weather notes that she believed might affect the print's visibility, but never conclusively did. The town held a small, slow-moving ceremony to acknowledge the print's rediscovery, though it was mostly a matter of standing near it and nodding, followed by the quiet passing around of a dry biscuit, traditionally served on days when history appeared but didn't insist upon itself. The boot print, or print, of unknown origin, was soon included in the official records of the Museum of Almost Discovery. Though it remained outdoors, visited occasionally by locals and drifting travelers who had lost their way or intentionally sought things that couldn't quite be confirmed. A small bench was placed nearby for viewing purposes, and a visitor logbook was set out on a pedestal made from a former fence post where guests could leave comments such as appears footprint adjacent, could be a boot or not felt, historically adjacent, and in one case, reminded me of my cousin Marvin, who also left no trace. Over time, theories began to accumulate around the print, not formal hypotheses, but rather soft musings spoken aloud during long pauses in conversation. Some believed it belonged to Alexander himself, a final imprint from his legendary toward the fog, though this theory required several assumptions about footwear, foot size, and the direction in which he may or may not have once walked. Others proposed it was Ilias's, left behind in one of his circuits around the non-coastline, while a third group suggested the print predated both men entirely. The remnant of an ancient inhabitant who had once thought about going somewhere new and then decided against it. A brief movement emerged among the more poetic residents to rename the print the Soul of Intention. But this was abandoned after someone pointed out that it might confuse visitors into thinking it involved fish. Children were brought to view the site on clear days when lessons were being held outside due to roof maintenance at the school, and were instructed to sit quietly and consider the possibility that the ground remembered more than people did. Some drew the print in their notebooks, others traced it in the dirt beside it, and one child built a small replica out of leaves and string, which was later added to the museum under the label Interpretive Footprint, Third Generation. The seasons passed as they always did, slowly and without narrative, and the footprint remained fading slightly, then being reinforced by new impressions, none of which could be conclusively linked to the original, but all of which contributed to its myth of soft permanence. In winter, it disappeared beneath snow and reappeared in spring, sometimes in the same shape, sometimes slightly altered, and this variability was itself noted as part of its essence. Pilgrims, if one could call the occasional thoughtful walker, that continued to arrive now and then, always surprised at how underwhelming the print was, and always quietly pleased by that fact. One visitor brought a spool of thread and placed a single strand around the print in a spiral, saying nothing, and leaving without retrieving it. The thread remained for several days, then blew away in the wind, which was taken by some as a sign that nothing was meant to stay, even when it didn't seem like much had ever started. And so, the indeterminate boot print persisted. Not as a discovery, not as proof, not as evidence of any particular person having done any particular thing at any particular time, but as a space in the ground that suggested something may once have happened and might still be happening in the form of remembering that it could have. The town, never eager to finalize meaning, accepted this fully, and the print became yet another quiet point of reference in a landscape where history was not written, but softly implied, not taught, but gently evoked, a single, shallow dip in the soil that held no answers, asked no questions, and yet said more about exploration than 1,000 maps that had led definitively somewhere else. Asterisk, after the rediscovery and careful non-analysis of the indeterminate bootprint, which by that point had achieved a level of regional reverence best described as tepid awe, the townsfolk began to once again feel the slow and indistinct pull of interpretive obligation, though no one asked for it and no one fully wanted it. The growing inventory of indefinite relics, half-men ceremonies, and softly squintable landmarks seemed to call for the next natural but unnecessary step: the formal and entirely symbolic gathering of thinkers, or at least sitters, to examine, organize, and completely fail to resolve the ever-growing archive of charts, maps, diagrams, and illustrative gestures that had, over the years, accumulated like dust with purpose, not oppressive, but present. This event, which eventually came to be known as the Council of Directionless Charts, was not announced with any formal invitation or signage, but was instead murmured into existence one rainy afternoon when Gilda, noting the increasing clutter of hand-sketched paths, spirals, annotations, and topographical errors in the back corner of the Museum of Almost Discovery, remarked to no one in particular that perhaps someone ought to look at these. As with all great undertakings in the region, her statement neither commanded nor inspired, but simply lingered, eventually becoming a vague consensus through the repetition of statements like, "Yes, probably, sometime soon," and "there's a lot of lines, aren't there?" Thus, on the third Thursday, after the second mild fog following the early harvest of the root crop, 8 individuals, none of whom considered themselves leaders, but all of whom had worn hats at some point, convened in the map chamber, a room that had not been designated as such but happened to contain more flat surfaces than most. The charts were laid out carefully, but without urgency, overlapping and curling at the edges, drawn on parchment, cloth, bark, and, in one case, the underside of an old table leaf. Most of the diagrams had no titles. A few had dates that were clearly wrong, or directions such as westish and upward, but not too far. Some maps appeared to show the local region, but distorted, as if drawn by someone lying on their side. Others appeared to depict areas no one had ever heard of, or possibly dreams that had been misremembered as facts. One map was just a single circle labeled "around here." The council began with a moment of quiet observation, followed by a longer moment of shared silence, and then a period of mutual leafing, during which pages were lifted, turned, partially examined, then placed. Back without comment, tea was served, then forgotten. Asterisk, asterisk. Long after the Council of Directionless Charts had quietly dispersed, leaving behind nothing but lightly annotated spirals and a collection of uncertain lines that may have represented journeys, or may simply have been exercises in abstract ambition, the townspeople, or at least those who still occasionally met in the Museum of Almost Discovery to nod in synchrony, turned their subtle attention to a geographical feature that had long gone unconsidered, but which, through a slow accumulation of almost mentions, began to demand a kind of passive recognition. This feature, which had previously been referred to only in terms of other things, such as that rise past the goats, the bump before the slope that leads nowhere, and that place where someone once paused, was a hill of no particular prominence or shape, but one that had been consistently not overlooked, which is to say that it was seen but not observed, referenced but not remembered, acknowledged without ever truly being known. As the collective mood of the town leaned ever further into its tradition of assigning gentle importance to things that might have once been near something potentially meaningful, the idea slowly took hold that perhaps the hill should be given a name, not a name of authority or definition, but a provisional one, a kind of placeholder recognition, as if to say that while no one truly understood its significance, there was enough consensus to admit that it had a presence that ought to be softly labeled. This idea emerged, not through any speech or suggestion, but rather through the gradual increase of statements, like it might help to have something to call it. We could, at the very least, say it's been noted, and no harm in giving it a temporary name, just in case someone once looked at it with meaning. Thus began the process of the provisional naming of the hill that might have been looked at, a process that followed no particular rules or timeline and involved more sitting than speaking. more tilting of heads than declarations, and more tittering than deliberation. The first proposed name, offered by Orlin the post-theorist, was the Place of Possible Glance, which was received with mild interest, but eventually dismissed for being too certain in its suggestion of visual contact. Gilda countered with Hill of Unverified Regard, which was written down, stared at, and then left alone for 3 weeks without further comment. Others suggested names such as Elevation of Elsewhere, the Upper Slope of Ambiguity, That, and possibly Up. Each name was briefly entertained, then gently allowed to drift away like most ideas in the region, carried off by the quiet current of collective non-incitements. The hill itself, during this period of naming indecision, remained as it always had, slightly elevated, vaguely grassy, occasionally visited by wind, and mostly ignored by the sheep who grazed in its vicinity. No new discoveries were made upon it, and no particularly meaningful footprints were ever found on its surface, though someone once believed they saw a rock in the shape of a gesture, which turned out to be just a rock. The hill's greatest claim to fame remained the fact that it had, according to one of the older maps from the Council's archive, been within the general field of view of a line labeled Speculative Gaze, drawn in a faded reddish tone that no one could confirm was ink. As the naming discussions continued, or more accurately, extended themselves through quiet coexistence with other conversations, it became apparent that the true name of the hill, if such a thing could exist, would have to reflect the uncertainty of its importance rather than assert any actual knowledge of it. This led to a short list of provisional names, including the hill that might have been probable high ground of past attention, minor uplift of unclear significance, and that which may have been regarded or not. The townspeople, in their usual manner, did not vote or reach a decision, but instead began to refer to the hill using whichever phrase felt appropriate to the moment, creating a landscape in which the same hill could be known by 5 or 6 different names within the span of a single afternoon. A small wooden post was erected near the base of the hill, bearing a slate onto which the various names were etched and then gently crossed out with chalk, allowing each new visitor to choose the title that best suited their level of uncertainty. Children were encouraged to sketch the hill during their quiet observation hours at school, and many of their drawings were displayed on the east wall of the museum, beneath a handmade banner that read, "Representations of that thing." Over there, some drawings included imagined figures at the top of the hill, gazing outward, while others showed only the shape of the hill itself, surrounded by annotations like, "Looks like it's been noticed," and "Probably nothing." The most popular depiction was a blank page with the words "See above" written at the top, suggesting either an error or a deeper philosophical reflection. As time passed and the seasons changed in their usual politely paced manner, the hill took on a kind of understated mythos, not because anything had happened there, but because it had continued to exist in quiet consideration. It became the subject of several community performances, including a silent walking meditation around its base, and a yearly event called The Noticing, in which townspeople gathered to stare in its direction without speaking for the length of a kettle boil. These rituals, though uneventful, were valued for the way they provided structure to the act of vague remembrance, and for their ability to create communal stillness. Eventually, it was agreed, not formally, but through prolonged use, that the most fitting name for the feature was the hill that might have been looked at, a title that captured not only the topographical nature of the rise, but also the long tradition of nearly knowing, nearly naming, and nearly discovering that defined the town's entire relationship with the past. This name was added to the museum's growing list of officially unofficial landmarks, inscribed beneath the larger heading locations of possible attention, and placed beside other items such as the fence post of consideration and the tree that was pointed at vaguely in the mid-afternoon. The hill, now softly named and gently noticed, remained as it always had, a quiet rise in the land, meaningful only insofar as people allowed it to be. A gentle upward curve in a landscape of unresolved moments, bearing the weight of all that might once have been seen or not, but which, in any case, had been allowed to exist without urgency or finality. A feature not of history itself, but of the way history feels when one is not quite certain it occurred. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. The ceremony of folding the map back incorrectly was not, strictly speaking, a ceremony in the traditional sense, nor was it ever officially declared one. But over time, it came to be regarded as such by virtue of its recurrence, its lack of resistance, and the mildly formal way in which it was performed by those who didn't entirely know why they were doing it, but continued to do so anyway because not doing it would have introduced the discomfort of change into a process already committed to the preservation of gentle ambiguity. The origins of the ceremony can be traced back to the earliest days of the Council of Directionless Charts, during which time the folding of the maps, which were rarely needed to go anywhere but were handled regularly for the sake of appearing active, became an unconscious ritual among those charged with their care. It was noted by several observers that no matter how carefully a chart was unfolded, no matter how delicately the corners were aligned, or how precisely the creases were matched to their previous states, the act of returning the map to its original shape always ended with a fold that was slightly off, a corner sticking out, an edge not quite aligned, or an unplanned crinkle that created a bulge when stacked. At first, these errors were considered mistakes, then quirks, and finally, with the passage of time and the softening of expectations, they became an accepted and even celebrated part of the process. The first person to officially comment on this phenomenon was Tharn, a slow-moving thinker known for his interest in partial repetition, who once said, while holding a map that now resembled a crumpled pastry more than a navigational tool, perhaps, "The map wishes not to be as it was," a phrase that, although immediately dismissed as poetic overreach, was later printed on a commemorative tea cloth that hung for years in the museum's back hallway, occasionally falling down and being sideways, as more townspeople began to engage with the charts, not for travel, but for the quiet exploration of speculative paths that had never been walked. The act of folding them back became a moment of shared imprecision, a collective gesture, of minor failure that somehow felt appropriate, even respectful, to the uncertainty the maps embodied. Thus, what had begun as an accident evolved into a rite, and over time, people came from nearby settlements simply to witness the gentle, deliberate incorrectness with which the maps were folded. The process was never rushed. A chart would be carefully selected, often chosen based on its current fold state, thematic ambiguity, or resistance to clarity. It would be brought to the central table, usually by Gilda, Orlin, or whichever townsperson had most recently been seen standing near the maps, and gently unfolded with quiet reverence, allowing its contents to be viewed not for what they said, but for how they looked while saying very little. Long before the concept of signaling, and even longer before anyone agreed on what might be signaled if signaling were ever to become necessary in the future, there existed within the town, or perhaps simply in the minds of a few of its more contemplative residents, the vague idea of a bell that might, under the right circumstances and with sufficient pretext, be rung not necessarily to announce anything, nor to warn, celebrate, or summon, but simply to mark a moment as having happened with slightly more formality than a nod, and perhaps slightly less finality than a door being gently pushed open and then pulled closed again when no one stepped through. This idea of the bell was not urgent, nor was it widely discussed, but it lingered in the air like a question never quite asked, just in a way that keeps one glancing toward a shelf that might someday hold it. The hypothetical bell, as it came to be referred to in passing, had no known origin, no recorded design, and no location, either present or proposed. Smaller events, not that there were larger ones, such as the yearly quiet turning of the sign that no longer pointed anywhere, or the equinoxial survey of the fence that had never been completed. These pauses, which were not scheduled and not measured, formed the majority of local time and were cherished not for their productivity, but for the way they allowed thought to drift, slowly, like fog over an unused path. And it was in one of these pauses, or more accurately, in a collective recognition of overlapping pauses that became a pause of historical note, that the idea of the hypothetical bell seemed closest to consideration, though still not close enough to warrant action. It began one mid-morning that could also have been early afternoon, depending on the way the shadows angled themselves, when Gilda, who was tracing a loosely estimated map of possible root vegetable storage caves, paused with her hand resting just above the page and said, not directly to anyone, if there were a bell, and then paused again. She did not continue the sentence. No one responded. But the words settled into the room like a dry leaf landing on a tabletop, not disruptive, but noticeable. From that point onward, the idea of the bell began to occupy an invisible space in the collective town mind. Orlin, who once built a ladder that led only to the underside of his roof's overhang and had written a short paper on the concept of intentional redundancy, began carrying a small sketchbook filled with circles of varying diameter, each captioned "Possible Profile," with no explanation. When asked what the drawings were, he would sometimes reply, "Contours, just in case," and then resume watching his tea cool. Gilda, on her part, did not bring the bell up again, but it was generally assumed that she had already moved on to imagining what sort of moment might warrant its use. Had such a moment ever been categorized to begin with? There were, of course, discussions never formal about what the bell might not be. It would not, for example, be loud. If the bell were ever to exist, it would have to be of a tone soft enough not to startle, but resonant enough to suggest that something might have occurred. It would not be made of brass, which some found too declarative, nor of silver, which was considered impractical and likely symbolic. Clay was mentioned once, as was gently weathered wood with a hollow center, though both were quickly forgotten in favor of considering whether a bell might also be a gesture, such as a raised eyebrow or a drawn-out EH. At no point was there an actual meeting to discuss these matters. Rather, the bell's theoretical properties emerged slowly through tangential remarks, half-thoughts, and long silences, during which it became possible to imagine a future in which someone, at some undefined time, might simply nod toward the space where a bell could hang and say, "Now, perhaps," followed by the kind of pause that changes nothing but feels like it almost did. The location for this bell, should it ever exist, was likewise never agreed upon, positioned just above the doorframe so that it could be seen but not necessarily reached. Others preferred the idea of it hanging from a tree branch near the west end of town, where the path curved slightly for no geographical reason and the air often carried a sound that was easily mistaken for intention. Still others believed the bell should not be placed anywhere specific, rereading an old label whose original text had long since faded. As the years passed, though, again, time in the town moved less in years than in the return of specific weather patterns and the reappearance of certain birds. The bell became something of a communal placeholder for action not taken, a gentle metaphor for a kind of acknowledgement to soft for speech, to which locals would respond, "Not yet," or "It depends what you mean," or sometimes simply smile in a way that made the visitor wonder whether the question had been answered. And so the long pause continued, the one that had begun in the moment after Gilda had almost asked a question about a bell that did not exist, lengthening over the seasons and years, becoming a kind of slow rhythm, a background stillness that supported all the other gentle happenings of the town. The misfolded maps, and in this space which was not empty, but simply calm, the bell that had never been made remained unconsidered just enough to feel real, its absence gently echoing through a landscape more comfortable with imagining things than ever actually, making them ring. Asterisk, asterisk. The gathering that could have been a decision but wasn't did not begin with any announcement, invitation, or call for attendance, but rather unfolded over the course of a particularly temperate day when the air seemed to agree with the idea of shared occupancy. And the light fell in such a way that stepping outside felt like remembering something vague but agreeable, and it just so happened that, on this day, more people than usual found themselves drifting, not all at once, but eventually, to the outer edge of the town square, which was not actually square and had no defined borders, but was widely understood to be the place where people occasionally stood near one another when nothing more urgent required doing. And on this day, the standing slowly became a kind of collective leaning, not toward any object or center, but toward the quiet idea, though no one could say for certain what that might be. And so the gathering grew, gradually, gently, as if the presence of one person became an open door through which the idea of being present could pass into another. And soon there were enough people assembled that someone, though no one recalled who, suggested, not with words, but with a shift in posture, that a kind of topic might eventually be allowed to form, not sharply, not to move across the stones in the faint sound of a distant breeze rearranging dry leaves provided a kind of ambient underscore. Someone, possibly Orlin, though it may have been Tharn, cleared their throat, not forcefully, but just enough, to suggest that a sound might follow, and after a moment, it did. In the form of a statement so unassuming, it took several repetitions to register. Of recognition, the kind that happens when someone else says the thing you hadn't realized you were nearly thinking, and from that point forward, the gathering entered a phase of tentative expression, in which various participants offered fragments of sentences, elliptical references, but all of which slowly contributed to the sense that the group was maybe circling an idea, or at least the idea of having an idea. No one ever declared a topic. The conversation, if it could be called that, took on the texture of consensus. Not about what should be done, but about the feeling that doing something, even if unspecified, might not be entirely out of place, though of course there was no immediate rush. And during a particularly long silence that settled between two statements that may or may not have been responses to each other, a few attendees wandered to the nearby bench that was too low to sit on comfortably. The afternoon, devoted to considering whether the sky meant anything, did not begin with an observation, a question, or even a glance upward, but rather emerged over the course of several loosely connected hours during which the residents of the town found themselves by coincidence, habit, or gentle drift outdoors more often than usual, standing or sitting or slowly pacing in spaces that afforded a clear view of the atmosphere overhead, not because they had planned to look at it, but because nothing more pressing required their attention and the sky. Being there was as good a thing as any to be quietly near. It had been, according to Gilda's loosely labeled weather ledger, a sequence of days defined by sky, not dramatic sky, not sky full of portents or events, but the kind of sky that does not draw attention to itself and therefore, slowly and indirectly, begins to be noticed for its refusal to do so. Pale, with streaks of cloud that seemed to be made of something thinner than cloud but thicker than thought, the sky had, for several days, behaved in ways that were best described as politely ambiguous, not quite promising, not quite neutral, offering the kind of background presence that encouraged reflection without providing any specific prompts. It was Orlin, whose habit of staring at undefined points in space had long made him a kind of unofficial barometer for communal thought, who first remarked to no one in particular, "It's been the same for a while, hasn't it?" A sentence, which, though not about the sky directly, was received by those within earshot as referring precisely to it. And thereafter, a general awareness began to gather, not with speed or urgency, but with the steady accumulation of shared quietness, that perhaps the sky was due some sort of consideration, not as a weather system or a canvas of future storms, but as something that might, if looked at gently enough and without too many expectations, begin to say something back, or at least allow itself to be included in a broader kind of thinking. By mid-afternoon, several people had found seats near the old stone wall that bordered the less used side of the square, each positioned in such a way that their field of vision naturally included a generous portion of sky. And though no one had proposed a gathering or suggested a topic, it became clear through the slow syncopation of posture and gaze that the activity at hand, if it could be called that, was the mutual and mostly silent consideration of the sky as a possible bearer of something, not quite a message, but a presence that might contain shape, or mood, or meaning that didn't require translation. The first formal statement, if it can be called formal, came from Laura, who was known for speaking less than average, but usually with a kind of internal rhythm that gave her words the quality of a slowly turning wheel. And what she said, after several long minutes of soft skyward study, was it could be meaning something, if it wanted to, which no one replied with words, but several people nodded once, a gesture widely understood in the town as the conversational equivalent of opening a book to a random page and then leaving it there for someone else to possibly read later. This idea that the sky might mean something, but only conditionally and never directly, set the tone for what followed. As those present began to offer the occasional thought, not sequentially or in relation to each other, but in the form of isolated sky-adjacent reflections that, over time, began to form a kind of collective atmosphere, not unlike the sky itself, in which the individual shapes and silences could be appreciated not for what they said, but for how they existed near one another. Someone said, "Maybe it's a map we can't follow," and another added, or a list of things that haven't happened yet, while still another, who may have been the one who cataloged types of silence during the winter without snow. Observed, it feels the same even when it changes. To which someone else, possibly Tharn, replied, "That's how I feel too, sometimes." And though it was unclear whether that response was about the sky, or the statement itself, or something else entirely, it was accepted with the same quiet understanding that accompanied most remarks in the town. No conclusions were reached, no consensus formed, and no definitions were pursued. But throughout the remainder of the afternoon, the group, which had grown slightly and then returned to its original size, as if modulated by a windless tide, continued to sit and stand and shift occasionally, watching the sky not with scrutiny but with the kind of attention that makes no demands, allowing it to remain exactly as it was while still permitting the idea that it could mean something, maybe in some way that didn't require saying aloud. Gilda, who had been sketching light patterns in her notebook without looking down, eventually wrote a single sentence at the bottom of her page. "If it does mean anything, it's not in a hurry." And when asked later what she had meant, she simply replied, "That sounds about right," which became, for a time, the unofficial summary of the afternoon, though others offered alternatives, such as "it meant enough," and "maybe that's the meaning that it stays." As the light softened and the clouds reshaped themselves into less definite versions of what they had been before, the group slowly drifted apart, returning to their homes, workshops, and routines with no sense of having discovered anything, but with a shared understanding that something had, if not occurred, at least not been missed. And in the weeks that followed, when the afternoon was recalled, usually during other slow moments, when the sky once again behaved with deliberate unclarity, it was spoken of in tones that implied something valuable had been touched but not taken, noticed but not known. And thus the afternoon devoted to considering whether the sky meant anything became one more layer in the town's sediment of almost events. A soft accumulation of attentions given and meanings not insisted upon, a memory, not of what was seen, but of the way everyone agreed, without deciding, that it had been worth the time to look. The day they almost remembered what they had forgotten to begin arrived, not with a sense of anticipation, nor with any notable change in the weather, the light, or the pattern of the wind, but rather in the form of a collective inclination, not shared all at once or communicated explicitly, but slowly emerging in the rhythms of how people moved, paused, and spoke that morning, which was itself unremarkable, except for the unusually even spacing of footsteps and the slightly longer than usual silences between greetings, as if the entire town had shifted a fraction closer to some invisible awareness that hovered just beyond naming. It was Tharn who first remarked, without addressing anyone directly, that something was on the edge of coming back, a statement which, under ordinary circumstances, might have prompted a clarifying question or a second glance, but which, on this particular day, was instead received with a soft nod from Orlin, who happened to be nearby, followed by the gentle reply, "Yes, something, yes," and from there the town seemed to drift collectively into a state of suspended recollection, a gentle shared sense that something had once been known, or at least considered, and that perhaps, with enough care and without rushing, it might be remembered again, though no one was quite certain what it was, whether it was theirs to recall, or even if it had ever truly arrived in the first place. Gilda, who had been cataloging echoes in the northern-facing part of the town for several years, with no definitive results, paused in her measurements and stood quietly near the museum's outer bench, the one that faced no specific landmark, and stared at a corner of the sky where nothing unusual was occurring, yet which seemed to carry the same emotional texture as an old photograph slightly damaged by time and water, the kind of image that stirs memory not because of what it shows but because of what it nearly shows, or what it fails to conceal. Several townspeople, noticing Gilda's posture, began to feel something shift in their own memories, not in the form of details or events, but as the slow reawakening of a once familiar absence, the kind of gap that suggests something important was once located there, an idea, a task, a gesture, a name perhaps, but had long since drifted out of reach, leaving behind only the shape of where it might have been. No one proposed a gathering, and yet one gradually occurred, not in the town square, which on that day felt slightly too defined, but around the low garden wall near the untitled sculpture that some believed resembled a folded map, and others insisted was a bent chair, though most agreed it was neither, and preferred to leave it undescribed. Here, the people began to speak, slowly and without urgency, offering small pieces of language, not as statements, but as offerings, half phrases, like I think we once said, and was it before the bell that never, and it may have started when someone forgot to finish saying it, each of which was met with the kind of silence that does not signal confusion, but respect, the kind of listening that allows a thing to continue unfolding even if it never arrives. Asterisk. Asterisk, the attempt to confirm if the beginning had ever actually started did not come about through a formal process or even an accidental discovery, but rather through the increasingly common sensation, felt not all at once, but with gentle repetition, that there might have been, at some point in the past, a start to things, or to one thing in particular, or perhaps to the whole idea of the town's long, softly folded chronology, though no one could quite say when it had happened, or if it had, or whether it mattered, and yet this absence of certainty itself became something like a reason to inquire, not urgently and not directly, but in the way a person might glance repeatedly at the same tree across several seasons, and eventually feel the need to say aloud that they remember it being taller once, even if it wasn't. The question, such as it was, began with a remark from the archivist's assistant who, while rearranging an entire box of folders that had no contents but had long been labeled as possible startings, paused with a finger resting on the label and said, almost absent-mindedly, "It feels like we missed the beginning." And though this was not a new thought in the town, it was spoken that day with a kind of fresh softness, the way rain feels different depending on the color of the sky behind it. That remark was not challenged nor affirmed, but it made its way, in the manner of a slow breeze through a loosely shut window, into the town's shared mood for the next few days, appearing in offhand comments such as, "Was there ever a first time for this?" and "Maybe we began without knowing, and it's possible we're still in the part before it starts." These comments were not intended to lead to action, but, as often happened in the town, enough passive agreement eventually resembled intent, and it was decided not through vote or consensus, but through a kind of synchronized drifting, that an effort should be made to determine whether the beginning had in fact taken place. This effort was not formal, and no one was in charge, though several individuals quietly contributed materials they felt might help, including Gilda's collection of unmarked moments, a slim book of timestamps without corresponding events, or Lynn's single-sheet diagram titled Before, and a sealed jar Tharn had labeled First Air, which he claimed contained a sample of the earliest breath taken on a day he believed may have been original, though no record supported this. The jar was placed on a table in the Museum of Almost Discovery, not behind glass but atop a cloth with a note reading untested, unproven, possibly precedent. Over the next few days, a kind of calm inquiry spread across the town, not in the form of research or interviews, but as an altered way of seeing, in which people began regarding ordinary things, a shoe left by a door, a crack in the wall, a particularly old spoon, with the slow, quiet hope that one of them might turn out to be the first of its kind, or a clue left unintentionally at the start of something no one realized was beginning at the time. Conversations took on a slightly speculative tone, with people saying things like, "I think this might be earlier than it seems," or "Do you suppose we've been continuing something that never quite started?" Or even, "I keep thinking," of the day before that other day, and these utterances, though vague, created a sense of shared approach, as if the town was very slowly circling a point on a map that had not yet been drawn. One evening, just before dusk, a group gathered in the south field, the one that had been measured 5 different ways, and still refused to be the same, sized twice, and stood in a wide semicircle facing the horizon, not because anything was scheduled to occur, but because someone had once said that if a beginning had happened, it might have been here, though they couldn't remember why. They stood for a long time, saying little, some of them holding notebooks open to blank pages, others holding nothing at all. And as the light dimmed and the outlines of distant trees faded into grayness, someone, possibly the baker though, it may have been the cartographer who never mapped, said, "This feels like something we forgot to do," and a few heads nodded slowly in agreement. Not because they remembered anything, but because the statement fit the moment in a way. that made remembering feel almost possible. As the light disappeared entirely and the group dispersed without fanfare, there was no conclusion reached, but also no disappointment. Because what had been attempted was not a finding, but a kind of gentle asking, not of a person or a record, but of the shared quiet itself, which had, as always, listened without answering, and that was enough. In the days that followed, the attempt was occasionally referred to as the first check, or the search for the pre-beginning, or, more humorously, the almost initiation, though most people preferred to speak of it only in fragments. Like that time, we almost found the start, or the evening, the field nearly explained itself. No further attempts were planned, and none were needed, for the purpose had never been discovery. Only the permission to wonder aloud, softly, whether the line that everyone thought they were following had ever actually been drawn, and if not, whether it mattered at all. And so the question of the beginning, having been asked in the gentlest possible way, was allowed to rest without answer, folded back into the long, slow memory of the town, like a page left unmarked in a book, read often, but never in order, and in this way, the attempt to confirm if the beginning had ever actually started became not a beginning itself, but something just to the side of one, a pause, a glance, a moment where everyone nearly knew what they were nearly asking, and that, for this town, was as much a discovery as anyone needed. Asterisk the silence that briefly considered becoming an announcement first appeared, or more accurately, was first not entirely absent in the northern end of the town square, near the bench that had once been misidentified as a sundial due to the unusual shape of its shadow during late autumn afternoons, though most agreed that it had never kept time and had no interest in doing so. On that particular day, the silence was not new nor unexpected, but it carried a texture slightly different from the standard silences that were part of everyday life in the town. Silences that punctuated conversation, waited at the end of slow thoughts, or nestled comfortably between one motion and the next, just high enough to draw notice without insisting upon itself. Those present, a handful of residents engaged in the usual mid-morning non-errands, became slowly aware of the silence, not as an absence of sound, but as the presence of a space in which sound could have been, and perhaps was about to be, or had recently been postponed. It was Orlin who turned slightly toward the silence, not with surprise or inquiry, but with the same respectful posture he once used to examine rocks that had clearly not moved for centuries, and he tilted his head just enough to suggest to those nearby that something might happen, or at least had considered happening. No one spoke, because to speak into a silence that might become an announcement would be to break its potential, and so instead they listened not to what was being said, but to what might have been about to be said. The silence lengthened, though no one timed it, and at a certain point it began to take on meaning simply by continuing, as if its duration was an answer to a question no one had known they'd asked. Gilda, who had been drawing invisible boundaries in her notebook, paused her pen and whispered, "This might be the moment before," and her words, though soft, carried a kind of weight that quieted even the birds nearby. Or perhaps they were already quiet, and her words had simply matched them. The silence, now recognized by all present as something specific, not merely a gap, but a shape, began to feel as though it were balancing on the edge of becoming a sound, possibly even a sentence. There was no indication of what the announcement might have been had it arrived. Perhaps a statement of gentle clarification, or a name long unused, or the first few words of an explanation no one had requested. Some believed it might have involved the bell that still didn't exist, or the direction of the wind when no one was looking, or the meaning of the garden that refused to grow vegetables but continued producing identical weeds in precisely measured spirals. Whatever it was, the silence seemed aware of its role. It held itself carefully, like someone about to speak who cannot decide whether the thought is ready. More people gathered, not out of curiosity but out of alignment, drawn to the space around the silence. By the way, it shaped the air. A few of them sat. One or two brought out notebooks and held their pens just above the paper. One began to hum very faintly, then stopped. No one objected. The silence accommodated all of this. It was not a defensive silence, nor a hesitant one, but a silence in full consideration of becoming something else. The question, though no one asked it, began to form anyway. Would this silence transform into an announcement? Would it make the leap from potential to expression, from readiness to arrival? And if so, what would it say? And would saying? It diminished the feeling it had already created by not saying anything. Orlin, whose foot was now resting lightly against a cobblestone he once labeled possibly original, looked upward as if listening for confirmation from a cloud, then softly exhaled a breath that did not disturb the silence but rather contributed to it. Asterisk the afternoon in which the weather forgot what it was doing was, in almost every way, a day like others, not because it lacked detail, but because the details refused to organize themselves into anything predictable, and this failure of coordination, or perhaps it was simply an intentional act of known alignment, slowly became apparent to the residents. Not as a disruption, but as a kind of shared question that none of them could phrase clearly, yet all of them seemed to be asking. The morning had started with what most agreed was a light overcast, though when pressed, no one could remember seeing clouds, only the impression of cloudness, a general dimming of things without any visible source. Birds had flown, but not in straight lines, and their calls had come at odd intervals, like sentences spoken with missing verbs. By midday, the temperature was neither warm nor cold, but carried the faint suggestion of both, changing slightly depending on whether one stood beside a wall, or near a tree, or next to someone, who was also trying to decide whether to roll up their sleeves. Gilda, always attentive to environmental shifts, noted in her unlined notebook, feels as though the air is waiting to be told what kind of air it is, which Orlin read upside down and said, without smiling, "Yes, that's the atmosphere I've been noticing too." By early afternoon, shadows had ceased to commit to any particular direction, overlapping and doubling back on themselves, such that a single chair cast a shape more complex than the chair itself, and someone, possibly Laura, who had taken to sketching negative spaces, remarked that the day appeared to be rethinking its structure. No one called it strange, because it didn't feel strange exactly, just loosely guided, like a song played on an unfamiliar instrument. Not out of tune, but not quite resolved either. Raindrops began to fall at one point, or at least people believed they had, because several reported the sensation of being lightly tapped on the shoulders and arms, though no one could produce a drop to point to, and no wetness remained on surfaces, which led to a brief conversation near the old statue. Base about weather imagined, weather still counted as weather, to which Tharn responded, "If it made you react, then it happened enough." A sentiment that everyone agreed captured something about the afternoon's rhythm. Later, wind passed through the town, not from a specific direction, and not with consistent strength, but more like a series of hesitant thoughts expressed in movement. It lifted leaves only halfway, moved papers a few inches before returning them to the ground, and was accompanied by a scent that no one could name, though everyone described it as familiar, possibly a mixture of dust and not quite ripe citrus, or maybe the smell of a room that had once held an argument and later forgot it. Several people stood still just to feel what the weather was trying to decide. Children ran, then stopped, not because they were tired, but because the air felt like it was about to change, and then it didn't, and they waited, smiling as if something might still occur. The trees swayed, but not in unison, each seeming to follow a different breeze, and one tree, a crooked ash near the post office, appeared to move slightly against the wind, which someone pointed out, prompting a quiet murmur of consideration, but no conclusions. Around this time, a few residents began gathering near the sundial. That wasn't meant to mark time, but because its presence, long misunderstood, seemed perfectly matched to a day in which nothing wanted to define itself. One person suggested that the weather was not misbehaving, but simply forgetting, or perhaps resting from the effort of being weather, allowing the elements to interact on their own terms without being reminded of their usual order. "It's like it stopped narrating itself," said the cartographer, who never finished maps, and several nodded at once, glad that someone had found a sentence to describe what they all felt. By late afternoon, the sky had become a pale suggestion. Of itself, not bright, not dim, but the sort of color that existed mostly in the idea of a color, a non-committal hue that one might find on a memory of a wall. No one checked forecasts, because it was understood that nothing official could explain this particular arrangement of sensation and suspension. The weather, in its gentle forgetfulness, had become something like a mirror, reflecting not images, but attitudes, and so the townspeople moved with the same uncertainty. Opening windows, they soon closed, picking up jackets and setting them back down, beginning to say things they never finished. Gilda eventually made a small sign, which she placed near the bench that faced in no particular direction. The sign read, "The sky may resume later, or not," and no one changed it because it seemed accurate enough. Evening came not with sunset, but with a gradual fading, a slow unnaming of light that left outlines but not shadows. People lit lamps slightly earlier than usual, not because they needed them, but because the gesture of doing something made the day feel more like itself. And when the weather, still indistinct, began to move toward what might have been calm, or repetition, or simply the next unnoticed shift, no one marked the transition. The day was allowed to conclude not with understanding, but with a collective shrug of quiet acceptance. Later, in the community record, a single entry appeared. The afternoon was weather. Possibly it was signed by no one, and yet recognized by all, and thus the afternoon, in which the weather forgot what it was doing, was remembered not for what occurred, but for how gently it allowed the town to wonder if anything had. Asterisk, asterisk, the walk that everyone took separately but at the same time didn't begin with an invitation, a bell, or even an intention, but rather through a kind of subtle, town-wide rhythm that fell into place without falling at all, a barely noticeable alignment of footsteps, thoughts, and the vague feeling that staying indoors would somehow be missing something, though no one could have explained what that something was without first pausing too long to think, and by then the moment would have shifted and the thought would be gone. It started, if it can be said to have started, in multiple places at once, a door opening on the north side, a scarf being chosen on the west, a loose idea on the edge of someone's breakfast, about checking the mail, but instead turning toward the lane behind the shop with no windows. No one planned to walk, and yet they all did, not side by side, not as a group, and not even along the same roads, but each person's quiet movement into and through the town's gentle curves and soft paths was marked by a kind of echo that no one could hear, but that everyone nonetheless felt the sense that others were also walking, not ahead or behind, but parallel in a way that didn't require visual proof. The weather, as it often was in these moments, participated politely by being neither warm nor cold, carrying the faintest breeze, just enough to remind the skin it existed, but not enough to push anyone faster or in a particular direction. The sky remained unremarkable, which was appreciated, because too much sky would have imposed a feeling, and the walk, such as it was, did not want feelings imposed upon it. Some walked with no shoes, some with coats, but no need for them. Some with the company of objects that might have had meaning once a string, a notebook, an old receipt folded into a triangle, and yet none of it felt symbolic, just lightly familiar. Gilda carried a pin cone that had been resting near her back door for several weeks, not because it was relevant, but because her hand had chosen to. Orlin, who walked the same route he always did, but backward in sequence, felt a mild satisfaction that the cracks in the pavement made more sense when seen in reverse, and considered writing this down, but forgot his pencil, which was fine because he wasn't planning to record anything today. Along the far edge of the field, where grass grew only diagonally, two people passed each other at a distance of 30 feet and nodded without eye contact, which was widely regarded as the correct form of acknowledgement for simultaneous independent walking. Somewhere near the middle of the afternoon, though no one checked a clock, more people were outside than in, and the town seemed to move without moving, each footstep overlapping with another, of the streets, each pace creating an unspoken tempo that tied together porches, fences, hedges, and paths into a single ongoing sentence that didn't require grammar. The walk was not a loop, nor a straight line, nor a destination-based outing, but a kind of participation in the act of going without needing to get anywhere, a way of reminding the town that space existed and could be inhabited lightly, and that distance, when taken in unison across many quiet feet, becomes a kind of shared breath. Some paused by the low wall near the nearly abandoned gate and looked at the nothing beyond it, not out of wonder or mystery, but out of habit, the way a person might glance into a mirror not to see themselves, but to make sure something else still exists behind them. Others leaned slightly while walking, as if balancing invisible thoughts that had not formed yet and perhaps never would. Gilda stopped to press the pine cone into soft soil near the second lamppost and left it there without ceremony, its new position unnoticed by anyone. Asterisk, the day the clock was almost right, began, like most other days in the town, with a gradual brightness that entered without permission and touched every wall, table, and rooftop with a kind of casual light that didn't ask to be noticed. The clock in question had lived on the outer wall of the half-laboratory half-bakery for as long as anyone could remember, not remembering when it was installed. A large round fixture with a face that had once been white but was now more of a pale suggestion, with black hands that moved when they wanted to, paused when it suited them, and occasionally reversed for reasons the townspeople agreed not to interpret. It had never been considered accurate or even useful, but it had been considered, which was enough. People didn't look at the clock to know the time, but to remember that time was a thing that happened, whether measured or not, and the town had long accepted that the hands of the clock pointed not to facts but to feelings, the feeling of late, or maybe soon, or perhaps neither. But on this particular day, something was different, and not because the clock behaved better, but because time itself leaned toward it. Just slightly, as though curious what would happen if things nearly aligned, it was Orlin, bakery side to inquire about a loaf that didn't exist yet, who first looked up and said softly, "HM," not in surprise, but in acknowledgement, the way one might greet a tree that had changed shape very slowly. The hands of the clock pointed, quite plainly, to a time that made sense, not perfect sense, not precisely correct, but close enough that Orlin checked his pocket watch, which he had never once used to confirm anything, and found that, indeed, the difference was only 3 minutes. 3. The clock, for reasons unknown and likely unimportant, was nearly right. News of this alignment spread not through announcements, but through glances, tilts of the head, and the occasional softly murmured its close, which was enough to draw a small, gentle crowd by mid-morning, not gathered to celebrate, but to observe. Gilda arrived shortly after, holding a small notebook filled with sketches of timepieces that had never functioned, and after staring for a full minute without speaking, she made a quiet note. Clock behaving, unknown reason, likely temporary. No one disagreed. The children, who normally ignored the clock completely, stood beneath it and looked up, not because they understood the implications, but because the adults were doing so silently, and that always meant something unusual was happening. Tharn arrived carrying a cup that may have once held coffee and nodded slowly as he passed, saying to no one in particular, "Well, look at that," which was widely agreed to be the most accurate summary of the event. There was no consensus on what had caused the alignment. Some suggested the recent weather had softened the gears. Others proposed that perhaps the clock had been trying all along, and this was simply the day it succeeded in being close enough to matter. One person suggested that the clock might be tired of being wrong and wanted to see what rightness felt like, just briefly. Another thought maybe time had decided to meet the clock halfway. But the truth, if there was one, remained gently hidden, as truths in the town often did. As the day continued, people found themselves more aware of time than usual, not in a rushed or anxious way, but in the quiet sense that each minute was lightly tapping them on the shoulder, reminding them that it was here, just in case they wanted to look. Meals were eaten slightly more punctually, doors opened and closed with a soft awareness of their timing, and even the birds seemed to pause mid-flight before resuming their arcs, as though sinking to a rhythm they hadn't noticed. Before Gilda returned in the early afternoon to check the clock again and found it still nearly correct, now only 2 minutes off, and smiled, not because she was impressed, but because the consistency was endearing. "It's having a good day," she said aloud, and several passers-by nodded, as if the clock could hear and appreciate the sentiment. By mid-afternoon, the closeness of the clock's reading had begun to soften, not dramatically, but in slow degrees, a creeping drift that felt less like failure and more like a return to its natural state of gentle indifference. By the time the sun began its descent behind the tallest hill that had no official name, the clock was once again confidently unsure of itself, pointing to a time that didn't quite match any known hour, but still looked, in its own way, reassuring. No one was disappointed. If anything, the near correctness had reminded everyone of something both obvious and easily forgotten. That precision is sometimes less comforting than approximation, and that the beauty of a clock that is wrong most of the time lies in the rare and quiet moment when it decides, briefly, to almost be right. That evening, the community logbook contained a single line written in Orland's careful, blocky script. The clock knew the hour, more or less. That's enough, and no one added to it. No celebration was held, no photograph was taken. But, for days afterward, people glanced at the clock with a little more affection, as if it had tried something difficult and nearly succeeded, which in this town, as in so many things, was as good as success, and possibly better. And so the day the clock was almost right passed into memory, not with accuracy, but with admiration for the attempt and the understanding that some things are never meant to be perfect. Only present ... the boat that didn't float but still went. Somewhere had been sitting near the edge of town for as long as most people could remember remembering it. Not in the water, since there was none, and not on a trailer or supports or anything particularly boat-related, but resting as if it had always rested in the wide patch of dry grass behind the unused fence near the place where the path doesn't quite become a road. It was not large, nor small, nor any particular type of boat one could identify with certainty. It had a shape that suggested boatness more than insisted on it, and its wooden sides, worn and sunshaded to a color that lived somewhere between gray and the memory of brown, gave off the impression that it once knew water, or wanted to, or perhaps just understood the idea of it. No one in the town had ever seen it move. No one had tried to move it, and no one had asked where it came from, because asking would have implied an expectation of answer, and this boat was not the kind of thing that answered. It simply was that is, until the day someone noticed, or believed they noticed, that it wasn't quite where it had been. Gilda was the first to say something, though she said it not as a claim, but as a question to herself. I thought it was closer to the tree, spoken aloud while walking past with a basket of things she hadn't needed to carry. And though she didn't stop walking, the idea settled into the space she'd left behind. Later that day, Orland passed the same spot and, without knowledge of Gilda's remark, also paused, looked toward the boat, and made a sound that, while not a word, expressed the general feeling of HM. It wasn't much, but it was enough. That evening, someone else, possibly Tharn, though he refused to confirm, placed a small stone at the back edge of the boat's base, and the next morning it had been nudged several inches to the left. No tracks, no marks, no signs of tampering, no wind strong enough to explain it, just the boat, calmly where it now was, and not where it had been. From then on, it was quietly accepted that the boat, while not floating, and not in any traditional sense mobile, was moving. The rate of its movement was irregular, almost undecidable. Some days it remained completely still. Other days it appeared to have adjusted itself subtly, leaning into the sunlight, angling toward the suggestion of a path, or simply sitting slightly differently than memory recalled. A few residents began visiting more regularly, not to interfere, but to sit nearby and observe, as if waiting for it to reveal its method. Gilda sketched it 5 times across 1 week and noted small discrepancies in alignment each time. Writing boat may be adjusting position in relation to intention. Orland, who once built a map of wind that never changed direction, theorized that the boat might be navigating ideas instead of distance, moving in response to thought rather than push. Others believed it was following an unseen route, perhaps something it remembered from before, or something it had dreamed while still. Tharn insisted it was merely leaning into the shape the earth wanted beneath it, that the world itself might be tilting in small degrees to make room for things that waited long enough. No one tried to measure it formally, because measurement was considered a kind of intrusion, too loud, too definite. The boat continued. It did not rush, it did not turn. But over the course of weeks, and then months, it was undeniably no longer in the same place. Grass grew differently where it had been, the angle of shade changed. People walking by adjusted the length of their glance. It didn't arrive anywhere, not in the usual sense, but it kept arriving in new stillness, as if the destination was wherever it had just paused. One child placed a folded paper crane inside it, and the crane remained exactly where it had been placed for 7 days, then vanished, perhaps caught in a breeze, or perhaps taken by the boat as a passenger. After that, people began offering it small items, a feather, a coin, a string tied in a loop, not to fill it, but to acknowledge it. These things came and went. The boat never responded. Or, more accurately, its only response was its continued presence. It stayed, and yet not in the same way. Asterisk, asterisk.